All right, so today we come to one of the most famous passages in the New Testament and also one of the most misunderstood and misused. Just so you know, during this sermon, I will be borrowing a lot from Tim Keller as his teachings have revolutionized my thinking on the subject of marriage. So if you've read his books or anything on marriage, you'll recognize probably a lot of this, but it's just some really fabulous stuff here today. So let's dive in, shall we? Today we come to Ephesians chapter 5, and we will look at verses 21 through 33. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 through 33. And if you don't have a Bible with you, it's okay. The verses will be on the screen behind me. Ephesians 5, and we'll begin with verse 21. Paul writes, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband." This is God's word. All right, so we don't have time today to go over all the richness of every single verse in here, but I do think it's profitable for us to maybe take a 30,000-foot view of this passage and just pull out the main points here. That way we can get kind of a panoramic view of the wisdom of the Bible on the subject of marriage. So, point number 1 in your outline. What marriage is. What marriage is. So, what exactly is marriage? Well, this is the best known biblical passage on the subject of marriage, and Paul here answers that question. He actually quotes from the Old Testament in verse 31. So you could put verse 31 up there. So this is a quote. Paul says this. He says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." This is probably the best biblical definition of what marriage is. You see, because the Hebrew word here that they've translated united, that's a word that denotes a covenant. A covenant, right? So essentially what this verse is saying is a man will leave his father and mother and covenant with his wife. So a marriage is a covenant between two people. A covenant. Now, what's a covenant? Right? What's a covenant? Well, a covenant is this. A covenant is a deep, exclusive, permanent, legal, and personal binding commitment. Okay? I'll say that again. A covenant is a deep, exclusive, permanent, legal, and personal binding commitment. And so, the essence of marriage is not a declaration of present love. It's a binding promise of future love. It's a promise not to always feel love for the other person. It's a promise to always serve and care for the other person regardless of how one feels. Now, this is obviously in direct contrast to our current culture. It's in direct contrast to the modern American view of marriage. You see, the essence of marriage for modern America is chemistry, not covenant. It's all about chemistry, see. There was a study done about 15 years ago by a fellow named Dana Shapiro, where he interviewed 50 married couples who were getting divorced. Okay, so they got 50 married couples who were in the midst of a divorce, and he interviewed them. And at the conclusion of all these interviews, this is what he said about marriage. I'll quote him here. He says this, quote, "There is an inherent problem with monogamy." What's the problem? He said, passion and chemistry need spontaneity. And marriage, by definition, is not spontaneous. So marriage inevitably stifles passion and chemistry. End quote. Now, that's an interesting survey, and that's an interesting view of things. A wrong view of things, but an interesting view nonetheless. See, there's a better view, a different view, a more biblical view, and that is, I couldn't find a better quote than this. This comes from the famous poet W.H. Auden. He has a much different view of things. Here's what he says. I'll quote him too. He says, quote, "Any marriage, happy or unhappy, is infinitely more interesting than any romance, however passionate." End quote. Now, how in the world can he say such a thing? That any marriage, happy or unhappy, is infinitely more interesting than any romance, however passionate. How can he say that? Well, I'll show you. I'll show you what he means. So, if you're married in the room here today, I want you to right now think back to the very first time that you kissed your spouse, which would be your future spouse, probably. So think back to that time, for y'all's first kiss. Now, here we are 10, 20, 30, whatever years later. When you kiss them now, does it still have that same electric thrill to it as it did that first time? You're liars. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It still does. It doesn't have that same electrical thrill to it that it did that very first time. At least I hope it doesn't. I hope it doesn't have that same electricity to it. Now, why do I say I hope it doesn't? Well, here's why. It's because the chemistry, the electricity that modern America is so obsessed with, that passionate thrill, it's coming largely from your ego. That's what's producing the electricity. It's your pride that's producing it. That's really all that it is. It's your own pride. Think about it. Think about it. What makes that first kiss so electrical? It's this. It's the fact that this person, who you think is attractive and pretty great, it's the fact that they're into you. They're kissing me. Wow. This is awesome. This attractive, great person is into me. And look, I get it. That is exciting. That is neat. It is electrical. But you see, it is all about you. It's all about you. You see, you have, since birth, this deep need for affirmation. I have it too. Okay? You've got this deep need for affirmation. And at the moment of this first kiss, it's getting filled by this attractive, pretty great person. Okay? And so, of course, this feels wonderful. You are being affirmed by this other person that you think is pretty awesome. But again, it's all about you. It's all about you. So what happens is, over time, you start getting used to the fact that this person is into you. And, therefore, the electricity fades and fades and fades because you get used to it. It's not surprising anymore that they're into you. And so the electricity goes away. But I promise you this, As awesome as that electricity is during the first kiss, that momentary and fleeting thrill is nothing compared to the thrill of being in a covenant with another human being. It's nothing compared to. To be absolutely committed to someone else's well-being. That you would cut your arm off for them. That you would die for them. And they for you. That's pretty thrilling too. That's pretty electrical too. When you have that kind of a commitment to one another. It's pretty awesome. And it's not the same as the first kiss. It's not. It's infinitely better. Infinitely better. You see, you can have one night or 1 month of great passion and not make a single sacrifice. Not one. Which proves all that passion is about you. Just about you. Now, how does covenant passion and electricity develop? Well, I hate to break it to you, but it kind of takes time. It takes time for that to develop. You see, you have to really know the other person, and they have to really know you, and that takes time. It does. It takes suffering together. It takes enduring loss with one another. It takes lots and lots of arguing with one another, okay? It even takes enduring dead feelings for one another. It takes all that. You see, chemistry says this. Chemistry says, this is basically the modern view of marriage. It says, as long as you're meeting my needs and making me happy, I'll stay. But when you stop meeting my needs and making me happy, I'm out. I'm out. But here's what a covenant says. A covenant says this. A covenant says, when you stop meeting my needs and making me happy, I'll still stay. I'll still stay. Friends, that is infinitely more interesting and thrilling than any short-lived romance, however passionate. That's point number one. Marriage is a covenant. Number two, second point in our outline today, what marriage does. What marriage does. So there's actually several things marriage does, but we only have time for one today. And so let's turn now to verses 25 through 27. Verses 25 through 27. Let's check out one thing that marriage does. Verse 25, Paul says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. Okay, so when Christ comes into your life, what does he do? He changes you. He actually changes you, see? You were spiritually twisted, ugly, and dead. But when Christ came to you, he made you spiritually alive, radiant, and beautiful. See? And then, somehow, some way, Paul says that this is the basis of marriage. It's the basis of marriage. What in the world? What's Paul trying to say here? He's trying to say that when your spouse comes into your life, they change you. They change you. He's saying that Jesus works through them to turn you into the person he wants you to be. See? Now, important note here, please take note of this. Jesus is the one sanctifying your spouse, not you. Okay? Everybody get that? Okay? So please don't say, hey, don't get mad at me, babe. I'm just sanctifying you. It's my job to sanctify you, to make you a better person. Don't say that. That's not what's happening, okay? You're not sanctifying squat. Jesus is doing the work here. Jesus is doing the work. You are simply the vehicle he's using to change your spouse into his image. Okay? So please don't pull your arm out of socket, patting yourself on the back for how you're improving your spouse. Okay? You're not. Jesus is. Jesus is. Okay? Okay, so this is obviously also very counter to modern culture. Very, very counter to our modern American culture. So empirical studies are funny. So they tell us this. They tell us that most young single adults today say this. They say, I want someone who will not change me. I want to marry someone who will accept me just as I am. In other words, I'm fine. I'm fine, just the way I am right now. And so I want to get married to someone who will just add to my life. They'll just add to me. See, I'm pretty great right now. And so I don't really want someone to change me. I want someone to add to me. See, I want to get married so that I can sprinkle in some romance, sprinkle in some passion, sprinkle in some companionship, sprinkle in maybe some children to my life. I just want to add to my life. I don't want to change it. Well, the only problem with this modern view is that it's impossible. It's actually impossible. So, number one, you can't help but be changed by your spouse. You can't help it. When you enter into a covenant with another human, they will change you. Sorry, they just will. And number two, you are not fine just the way you are. You're not. Again, hate to break it to you, you're not fine. You're not fine. You are flawed in countless ways. And you know what a spouse will do? Expose all of them. That's what they'll do. They will expose all of your very many flaws. And so what ends up happening? You get very mad about this. This comes as a shock to you. And it comes with a lot of fury and rage when all your flaws start bubbling to the surface in your marriage. And so this, friends, is a primary reason why so many marriages in America end so early. It's shocking how many marriages end within 12 months. It's because of this right here, right? See, we thought marriage was supposed to do one thing, namely, make me happy and meet my needs, add a bunch of cool things to my life, when it was actually meant to do something else, to make you more like Jesus. To make you more like Jesus. You see, he who began a good work in you will see it to completion. He will. And guess who's the primary person he's going to use to do just that? Your spouse. That's the primary person he's going to use. And so what does verse 21 say? Verse 21 says, submit to that. Okay? Submit to this fact. Right? So let's read it together. Verse 21, Paul says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Do you see that? Husband, submit to your wife. Not just out of reverence for her, but out of reverence for Christ. Don't you see what Jesus is doing through her? See? Wife, submit to your husband. Not just out of reverence for him, but out of reverence for Christ. Don't you see what Jesus is doing through him? Okay, that's number two, what marriage does. We come now to point number three in your outline. what marriage needs. What marriage needs. Let's see how Paul frames biblical marriage. Look at verse 25. Verse 25. Here's what he says. He says, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." Do you see? Paul is framing all this in the gospel. See that? That's what marriage needs. Marriage needs the gospel. You see, unless you know and are confident in God's towering love for you in Christ, in the gospel, you'll not actually be able to do what you should do in marriage. Marriage would be a lot harder for you. Now, why do I say that? Well, let me give you a real life analogy. My wife and I, we've got a really good friend of ours in Kentucky who is a philanthropist. And so you all know what a philanthropist is, right? So he gives a ridiculous amount of money away every year to charity, like insane. Okay, millions of dollars away to charity every year. Now, why can he do that? Why is he able to do that? It's because he's making millions and millions of dollars every year from all the businesses that he owns. Okay? See, he can give so much money away over here because he's getting so much money over here. Likewise, there is no way you'll ever come to the place we've been talking about here of covenant electricity and passion. The place where through thick and thin, through conflicts and reconciliations, through times of difficulty and sacrificial service that produces deep, passionate oneness and love, you'll never get there without the gospel. You won't get there. Why not? Why not? It's because there will be seasons in your marriage when your spouse is tremendously depressed or anxious, when they have little to no feelings for you, when they're terrifyingly angry with you. And the one and only way you can continue to give love to them during those seasons is if you're continuously getting love from Jesus. See, it's the only way you can do it. You can only give love over here if you're getting love over here. So, if the main source of love in your life right now is your spouse, you're in big trouble. You're in big trouble. Because there will be seasons where they don't have much or any love to give you. And so, what you need is to hear the gospel. Hear the gospel again. Oh, and then hear the gospel some more. That's what you need. You need to be continually reminded that you are forever forgiven and loved through what Jesus has done for you. See? You need to be continuously reminded that you are safe in Him. Because you see, your marriage won't always feel safe. It won't. There will be seasons where it's crazy rocky and unsafe. And so in order for you to feel genuine safety and to give away safety and love and grace to your spouse, you have to be getting it over here from the gospel. Over and over and over and over again. And then if you do that, if you're getting tons of gospel over here, well, then you will have plenty of love left over to give to your spouse in those difficult seasons. Okay, that's number 3, what marriage needs. Lastly, we'll close with this. Point number 4, what marriage shows. What marriage shows. Let's read verses 31 and 32. 31 and 32. Paul says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church." See, we often we think the gospel is like a good analogy for our marriage. It's helpful. It's like a helpful analogy for our marriage. But actually what Paul just said is that our marriage is the analogy. See? Our earthly marriages are designed to show us the even deeper and more concrete reality of the magnificent love of Christ for His bride. See, it's your marriage that's the analogy. Your marriage is meant to show you that Jesus is the perfect spouse. See? With all the failures that you commit in your marriage and all the failures that your spouse commit, all of this is building and growing and changing and molding and morphing day by day, all to show you how perfect a spouse you have in Jesus. See? What did we do to Jesus? What did we do to Him? Well, our entire lives, we've rebelled against Him. We've shot Him double birds every day. And how did He respond? How did He respond? Did He say, "Hey, you're not meeting my needs and making me happy, so I'm out. I'm out"? Is that what He did? No. What did He do? Well, if you turn on the radio, you'll hear all these hyperbolic love songs with lyrics that say different things. Some of them will say things like, "I would cross the ocean for you." But you know what, friends? Those lyrics, they're not hyperbolic to Jesus. He actually would cross the ocean for you. In fact, He already has. He already has. You see, when you and I were lost in outer darkness, He crossed the infinite ocean for us. The space between heaven and earth. To pursue us. To find us. To rescue us. And to bring us home. He crossed the ocean for you. Oh, not at the risk of His life. At the cost of His life. He rescued you. You see, we didn't give ourselves to Him. Oh, but He gave Himself, all of Himself, for us. Every ounce. Even His very own life. And friends, you know this. Even now, as baptized believers, we still sin against Him. We still rebel against Him. We still shoot Him double birds. And how does He respond? He stays. He stays. See, because our Jesus is in a covenant with us. And this is a covenant He ain't never going to break. Never. He will never leave us. He will never forsake us. He's the perfect bridegroom, you see. The hymn writer puts it so well. The hymn writer says this. He says, "Jesus, my heavenly bridegroom, gave his life my wretched soul to save. Resolved to make his mercy known, he kindly claims me for his own. My filthy rags are laid aside. He clothes me as I become his bride. Himself bestows my wedding dress, the robe of his perfect righteousness. What a bridegroom.